By the time he found her, her lips were already blue. The car was on its side, pinned against a pine tree 60 feet below the highway. The storm had buried the tire tracks. Nobody knew she was down there. Nobody except him. He was 20 years old. He had no phone, no gear, no reason in this world to do what he did next. But he did it anyway. 9 miles. On foot. In a whiteout. And when the Hells Angels found out what this kid, this forgotten, invisible kid, had sacrificed to bring their woman home, the highway stopped. Before we go any further, drop in the comments right now, where are you watching this from? Whether you are settled in from Texas or tuned in from a quiet evening in Ohio, I want to know. This community shows up from every corner of this country, and every single one of you matters to this channel. Hit that like button right now if you believe that forgotten people deserve to be found. Because that is exactly what this story is about. And if you are not subscribed yet, this is the story that will make you want to be. Now, there is a particular kind of cold that exists only in the northern Rockies in February. It is not the cold you feel when you step outside on a winter morning in the city. This is something older, something more serious, something the mountain makes from deep inside itself. And on one February night, it nearly swallowed 2 people whole. He had nowhere to go, no family, no money, no future, just a cracked highway and a blizzard swallowing the Montana mountains whole. He was 20 years old, running from a life that had never once run toward him. Then, 50 yards off the road, buried in the timber and the dark, he heard it. A single sound that no one else on earth was close enough to hear. A woman's voice. Not screaming. Worse than screaming. Calling. The way someone calls when they've already been calling for a long time, and they're starting to lose hope that anyone will answer. What he did next, on foot, in a whiteout, with nothing but his own 2 hands, and whatever was left in a body the world had spent 20 years wearing down, would set off a chain of events that would shake an entire brotherhood to its core. Nobody saw it coming. Nobody. There is a particular kind of cold that exists only in the northern Rockies in February. It is not the cold you feel when you step outside on a winter morning in the city, the kind that stings your cheeks and makes you walk faster to your car. This is something older and more serious than that. This is the cold that the mountain produces from somewhere deep inside itself. A cold that comes up through the ground and down from the sky at the same time, that finds the gaps in your clothing and occupies them, that settles into your joints and your marrow like it has always lived there and is simply returning home. The Bitterroot Range in February does not look dangerous. That is part of what makes it so. The pine trees along the ridgeline wear their snow like a photograph, perfectly still, perfectly white, the kind of image people put on Christmas cards and holiday calendars. The Tulane highway that cuts through the pass is narrow and winding, but in good weather it is an easy enough drive. 40 miles to the nearest town on the eastern side. 40 miles of mountain road that on a clear day takes less than an hour. On this particular February afternoon, the highway patrol had pulled their last unit off the pass at noon. The plows had made one run in the morning and would not return until the storm broke, which the forecast said would be sometime around dawn. Cell service had died at the upper ridge, killed by the same weather system that was now dropping 2 inches of snow per hour on a road that nobody was supposed to be driving. The storm was not behaving like a backdrop. It was behaving like something that had made a decision. It moved with direction and with weight, not simply falling but pushing, driving horizontally across the highway in dense curtains of white that erased the tree line, erased the guardrails, erased the distance between 1 mile marker and the next. It did not howl. Howling implies something wild and uncontrolled. This storm was methodical. It covered things. It buried things. It was patient in the way that only very large and very cold things can afford to be patient. On this particular stretch of Route 12, in the space of 3 hours, 2 lives would collide in a way that neither of them could have survived alone. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. His name was Wade, 20 years old, 5 feet 11, though he carried himself shorter than that, the way people do when they have spent a long time trying to take up less space in rooms that did not want them. He weighed maybe 160 pounds, and that number was optimistic. He had the kind of lean that is not athletic but nutritional, the kind that comes from too many meals skipped, too many nights where dinner was a gas station hot dog and a bag of crackers eaten in a parking lot somewhere. Wade had aged out of the foster care system at 18. That is the bureaucratic phrase for it. Aged out. As though it were a natural process, like a fruit ripening. What it actually means is that on his 18th birthday, The state of Montana closed his file, removed his name from the placement roster, and wished him well in the general direction of the world. He had no family to go to. He had no savings. He had the contents of a single duffel bag and the address of a transitional housing program that had a 6-month waiting list. The 2 years between 18 and 20 had been a sustained exercise in improvisation. He had couch surfed in Missoula for 4 months until the welcome ran out. He had done seasonal work at a Christmas tree farm, then a warehouse outside Billings that let workers go in January when the post-holiday orders dried up. He had spent a summer in a campground, paying the weekly rate and working the counter at a bait shop nearby. He had no permanent address. He had no one to call in an emergency. His emergency contact on every form he had ever filled out in the last 2 years was blank. The coat on his back was an Army surplus jacket he had found at a Goodwill in Missoula for $4. Olive green, heavy canvas exterior, the kind designed for a different kind of cold than a Montana February blizzard. The zipper on the left side had broken 6 weeks ago, and he had safety pinned it shut at the bottom. The lining was torn at the left shoulder, the synthetic fill leaking out in small white tufts. It was not waterproof. It had never been waterproof, even when it was new. His boots were work boots, the kind sold in hardware stores for $40. He had resoled them twice using contact cement from a hardware store, pressing the separated soles back against the uppers and clamping them with binder clips overnight. They were not waterproof either. He was walking east on Route 12 because a man at a truck stop outside Missoula had told him there was warehouse work in the next county, a logistics company that was hiring for the spring inventory push. The man had seemed certain. Wade had written the address on a piece of paper and put it in his front pocket alongside $43 and a granola bar he had been saving since the previous afternoon. He did not look like a hero. He looked like a young man who was tired and cold and moving because stopping was not something he could afford to do. He looked like the kind of person that the world has practiced ignoring, the kind who walks through a gas station and the cashier looks past him, whose face never quite registers in anyone's memory. He was invisible in the particular way that only the very young and the very poor can be invisible. I want you to hold on to something before we go any further. This young man, right now, has every reason in the world to keep his head down and keep walking. He has $43 and a job lead and a coat with a broken zipper and boots held together with hardware store glue. He has nothing to spare. Not warmth. Not energy. Not time. He is walking east into a February blizzard with nothing but the arithmetic of survival, keeping his feet moving. Remember that. 60 miles to the west, in a converted warehouse on the edge of a small Montana city, a man named Boone was sitting at the end of a long wooden bar drinking coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Boone was in his mid-50s. He was broad across the shoulders in the way of men who have done physical work their entire lives. Not the cultivated broadness of a gym, but the functional, settled broadness of someone who has been lifting and hauling and bending since he was a teenager. He had thick forearms covered in dense ink that had blurred slightly at the edges with age, the way tattoos do when they have been lived in long enough. He wore his hair short and his beard close, both of them the same iron gray. He had dark eyes that were quiet in a way that people sometimes mistook for blankness until they looked a moment too long and understood that the quiet was not emptiness but depth. He had been president of the local Hells Angels charter for 11 years. Before that he had been road captain for 6, and before that he had been a prospect who showed up with a motorcycle, a work ethic, and very little else. He ran a legitimate auto salvage business on 4 acres on the south side of town. He paid his taxes. He employed 8 men, all of them charter members or family of members. The local sheriff did not love him and did not pretend to. But he respected the line that Boone maintained, the invisible boundary that kept the chapter's business on the inside of that boundary and the town's business on the outside of it. They handled their own. They did not import chaos. They did not need to. The charter was 47 members strong. They came from every background that a small Montana city could produce. Veterans, mechanics, a high school gym teacher, a man who repaired heavy equipment for the county. They rode together on weekends, and they worked their regular jobs during the week, and they gathered at the warehouse on Thursday evenings to talk and argue and drink and exist in the particular comfort of men who have known each other long enough to need very few words. The woman who had made all of this feel like something more than just a club was not a member. She had never ridden a motorcycle in her life. Her name was Carla, and she had been married to Boone for 22 years. She taught art at the high school 12 miles east. She was 51 years old, fine-boned and unhurried, with the kind of steady warmth that does not perform itself but simply radiates. She brought casseroles to the chapter's cookouts. She knew every member by name and knew the names of their children and their parents and their dogs. She remembered the date that a man named Russ had gotten out of a 2-year stretch and showed up at his door with a pot of soup and did not make it into a moment, just handed it over and asked how he was sleeping. She sent cards on birthdays. She attended funerals. If Boone was the chapter's authority, Carla was its conscience. She was the one who softened what needed softening and held firm on what needed holding. The men who would not have admitted to needing anything from anyone would have quietly admitted, if pressed, that the chapter would not be what it was without her. On this particular February afternoon, Carla was driving back from her mother's house 2 towns over. Her mother was 83 and had been having trouble with her hip, and Carla had driven over that morning to help her with some things around the house. Boone had called at noon when the weather began to turn and asked her to wait it out, stay the night, drive back in the morning when the plows had been through. She had looked at the sky through her mother's kitchen window. The clouds were heavy, but the road had looked passable. She had driven that pass 200 times. She knew it well enough. She told him she would be fine. She told him she would call when she hit the summit. She had been driving 40 minutes when the pass began to deteriorate. Carla always called Boone when she reached the summit. It was a habit she had kept for 22 years, a small ritual of the kind that long marriages accumulate, unremarkable in practice, but loaded with everything beneath it. A check-in, a reassurance, a way of saying, I am still here, I am on my way, I will be home soon. This time, the call never came. The 30 seconds before the wagon left the road were ordinary seconds. That is the thing about the moment before a disaster. It does not announce itself. There is no shift in the light, no thickening of the air. There is just the ordinary business of living, and then there is not. The windshield had been icing at the edges for the last 10 minutes. Carla had the defroster running at full, and it was holding the center of the glass clear, but the edges were frosting over in a slow creep that narrowed her field of vision without her quite realizing how much. The heater was running and the cab was warm and the wipers were keeping up with the snow, and for a few miles she had convinced herself that this was manageable. The rear wheels broke loose on a patch of black ice hidden under 4 inches of fresh powder. There was no warning. One moment the wagon was tracking straight and the next it was not, the rear end sliding left with a smooth, terrible efficiency that had nothing to do with her response on the steering wheel. She turned into it the way you were supposed to. It did not help. The guardrail came up fast on the right side. She had time to register it, to see it, and then the passenger corner of the wagon connected with the steel rail and the impact redirected the vehicle sideways, spinning it across the shoulder, and then the shoulder was gone. The wagon went over the edge. 30 feet of embankment, steep and heavily wooded, the pines growing close enough together that the vehicle struck 2 of them in the descent before coming to rest on its passenger side, pinned hard against a pair of thick trunks at the bottom. The engine died on impact. The headlights flickered once, a single weak pulse of light, and went dark. Inside the cab, Carla was suspended by her seatbelt, hanging sideways in the tilted vehicle, her left cheek against the door that was now the floor. The airbag had deployed and then deflated. Her right wrist was wrong. She knew that immediately, wrong in a deep structural way that the pain had not fully arrived at yet. There was something warm on the left side of her face. She touched it with her good hand and looked at her fingers. Blood. A gash above her temple from the side window. The glass had held, but the frame had flexed inward on impact and caught her. Her left leg was pinned. Not painfully, not yet, but immovably. The door frame had collapsed inward on that side, and her knee was wedged between the frame and the center console. She could not pull it free. She found her phone in her jacket pocket. No signal. Not one bar. She tried the horn. The electrical system was dead, killed by the impact. The horn made no sound. She called out anyway. She called out at full volume. A single sustained shout of help that the pine trees absorbed and the wind erased before it traveled 10 feet. Outside, the snow was falling at 2 inches per hour. It covered the undercarriage of the wagon in the first 4 minutes. It covered the tire tracks that cut off the highway above her in 6. 6 minutes after the wagon left the road, there was no evidence from the highway that a vehicle had ever gone over the edge. The gouged guardrail was already frosting over. The broken branches on the embankment were collecting snow on their sheared faces. The world above was repairing itself with patient, relentless white. Carla was invisible, and the temperature was still dropping. Wade was 70 yards past the skid marks when he stopped. He had not seen them. The snow had filled the tire marks in the asphalt and covered the gouge in the guardrail, and there was nothing visible from the road to indicate that anything had happened here. He stopped because the wind shifted. It was a brief shift, a momentary reorientation of the gale that had been battering him for the last hour and a half. Just a few seconds of relative quiet, the storm pausing to draw breath. And in that gap, in that slim corridor of reduced noise, he heard something. He could not have told you what it was, not with any precision. It was small. It was distant. It came from below the road, from somewhere down the embankment on his right side, muffled by distance and trees and snow. It could have been the wind finding a particular gap in the timber. It could have been an animal. It could have been nothing at all. He stood still. The wind came back. The sound disappeared. He waited. He did not know why he was waiting. He was cold and he was tired, and the warehouse job was $43 and 9 miles away, and standing still in a blizzard is the second worst thing you can do, the first being lying down. He waited anyway. The wind dropped again, just for a moment. Just long enough. A voice. A woman's voice. Not a scream, not the sharp burst of sound you make in the first second of something going wrong. This was different. This was the voice of someone who had been trying for a while. The kind of calling out that has settled into a rhythm because the person doing it has made a quiet and terrible calculation that they need to keep making noise even though they are no longer certain the noise is reaching anyone. Wade looked at the embankment. He looked at the road ahead of him, at the white emptiness stretching east toward a town he could not see and a job that he was not certain was still there. He thought about the $43. He thought about the granola bar. Then he moved to the shoulder and slid down the embankment. Here is what Wade did not know as he went over that edge. He did not know whose wife was in that car. He did not know what patch she wore displayed on the wall of a converted warehouse 60 miles west. He did not know what her husband's men were capable of when someone they loved was in danger, or what they were capable of when someone they loved had been helped. He did not know any of it. He had heard a voice in the dark, and he had gone toward it. Hold on to that. Because this, right here, this moment on the shoulder of Route 12, this was the collision I told you about at the beginning. This was the moment when two lives that had no business intersecting reached out and found each other in the snow. The smell hit him before he saw the car. Gasoline and hot metal and the sharp green smell of freshly sheared pine. It was a combination that had its own particular meaning, and Wade understood the meaning immediately even if he had never smelled it before in exactly this combination. He found the wagon 30 feet below the highway, on its passenger side, pressed against two thick pines at the bottom of the embankment. The roof had crumpled on the passenger side from the impact. One rear wheel was still spinning very slowly, lazily, catching the light from somewhere. The snow was already accumulating on the undercarriage. He could see movement through the cracked rear window. A shape, shifting slowly. He called out. His voice was raw from the cold, but it carried. The answer came back immediately. A woman's voice, steadier than he would have expected given everything, but exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleepiness. She told him she was inside. She told him she could not move her leg. Wade circled the vehicle, testing every door with both hands, putting his weight against each one. The driver's door faced the sky, and there was nothing to brace against to get the leverage he needed. The rear hatch was crushed inward, the latch mechanism destroyed. The windshield was his only option. He found a rock in the snow. It took him a moment to dig it out of the frozen ground, his fingers already stiff and unresponsive enough that he had to use his whole hands like scoops rather than his fingers individually. He swung it against the windshield with both hands. The glass gave on the third strike. It did not shatter cleanly. It crazed and folded inward in chunks, and the edge of the frame as he knocked the remaining pieces out caught his forearm and opened a cut 4 inches long across the outer surface. He registered the pain and filed it somewhere distant and climbed through the opening. Inside the cab, the world was tilted 30 degrees and covered in a thin layer of safety glass crystals that caught what little gray light came through the broken windshield. Carla was there, suspended in her seatbelt, her dark hair hanging sideways. The blood from the cut above her temple had tracked down the side of her face and dried there. Her eyes were open and they were sharp, and they found him immediately. She was not panicking. That was the first thing he noticed. She was clearly in pain and clearly afraid, but she was not unraveling. She was watching him with the focused attention of someone who has decided that the person who just climbed through the windshield is their best and only option and is investing fully in that decision. He told her his name. She told him hers. He looked at her leg. The door frame on the lower side of the tilted cab had buckled inward, and her left knee was wedged in the gap between the frame and the center console. He could see immediately that he could not pull it free by hand. He needed to move the frame. He found a strip of the door's interior trim panel that had broken free from the impact, a piece of rigid plastic about 18 inches long, and he wedged it into the gap and leaned on it with all of his body weight. The frame moved 1/4 of an inch. He adjusted his grip and leaned again. Another 1/4 inch. He could feel something in his lower back protesting loudly, and he ignored it the way he was increasingly ignoring all the physical information his body was sending him. It took 11 minutes. His knuckles split twice on the metal. He did not stop. When the gap opened enough, Carla's leg came free. She cried out at the sudden release, not from pain, but from the pure involuntary relief of it, the way a body responds when something that has been wrong for a long time becomes right again. She pressed her good hand over her mouth and breathed hard through her nose for a moment, composing herself. Then she looked at him. She said, "Let's go." Getting Carla out of the wagon and up the embankment was a separate ordeal from getting her out of the cab, and it took longer than either of them wanted. Wade fashioned a harness from the cargo net he found in the wagon's rear storage area, a mesh net designed for keeping groceries from rolling around, now repurposed into something that looped under Carla's arms and around her waist, and gave him something to pull from above, while she used her good leg and her good arm to push herself up through the loose snow. The broken wrist made every push a negotiation. She did not complain about it. It took 25 minutes to cover 30 feet of embankment. By the time they reached the shoulder of Route 12, Wade's arms were shaking with a tremor that was not entirely from exertion. The cold was doing things to his muscles, making them unreliable in small ways that he could not fully track because his attention was occupied elsewhere. They stood on the highway shoulder together. Or rather, Wade stood and Carla stood partially, favoring her right leg, her left arm held across her chest. The storm was at full force around them. No cars, no lights in either direction, no sound from any human source anywhere. Just the wind, which was moving horizontally now, driving the snow flat across the road surface so that the highway itself had disappeared under a shifting white plain that gave no indication of where the pavement ended and the shoulder began. Wade looked east. He looked west. He did the arithmetic. The nearest town was 9 miles east. He had passed no structures on the western side in 2 hours of walking. No traffic was going to come through this pass in this weather on a road that the highway patrol had officially closed. His phone, a prepaid flip phone with a cracked screen that he had owned for 8 months, showed no signal and had 11% battery. He told Carla the distance. She looked at him for a moment. Her voice was very steady when she said, "Can you carry me?" He looked at her. He looked at the road. He thought about what that actually meant, physically, concretely, over 9 miles in knee-deep snow with a busted forearm and a body that was already running on the kind of deficit that has a name in medical textbooks. He said, "Not the whole way, but I'll figure it out as we go." 9 miles. In a whiteout. With a woman who could not walk in a temperature that was already well below what the human body is designed to operate in without protection. Wade had no plan beyond the first step. He had no gear beyond what was on his back and what he had pulled from the wreck. What he had was $43 in a front pocket, a jacket with a broken zipper, boots held together with contact cement, and a decision he had already made at the bottom of that embankment when he climbed through a broken windshield for a stranger. He took her good arm across his shoulders, put his arm around her waist, and started walking east. The first 2 miles were the ones where he still had something in reserve, where the body's emergency systems were fully online and running, flooding his muscles with whatever chemistry crisis produces. He used those miles to build what he could. He tore the lining out of his jacket in strips and fashioned a crude sling to immobilize Carla's broken wrist against her chest, reducing the movement that was causing her the most pain. Under the wagon's passenger seat, secured by a strap to the seat frame in the way that cautious people sometimes secure things they hope never to need, he had found an emergency mylar blanket in a small orange pouch. He wrapped it around Carla's shoulders over her jacket, and for the first mile it helped, catching her body heat and reflecting it back. They moved slowly. Carla was putting as much weight on her right leg as she could, and using Wade's frame to compensate for what the left leg could not provide. They were not walking so much as coordinating, two bodies finding a shared rhythm that worked around the damage. Carla started talking. He would come to understand later that this was not incidental, that she was doing it deliberately, but in the moment it felt like the most natural thing in the world, two people moving through an extraordinary situation, using ordinary language to stay tethered to ordinary life. She told him her name. He told her his. She asked what brought him to Route 12 in February. He told her about the warehouse job. She said she thought that company had moved their operation. Actually, she was pretty sure they had relocated to a facility on the other side of the valley last fall. He processed this information without breaking stride. He said, "Well, I guess I'll figure something else out." She said her school needed a maintenance worker. Had needed one since September. He said he'd keep it in mind. The ordinary conversation was everything. It was the counterweight to the cold, the ballast that kept them both from tilting into the particular mental state that extreme cold produces, the dreamlike, slow-motion unreality that precedes the body's decision to stop fighting. As long as they were talking about maintenance jobs and relocated warehouses, they were still inside the ordinary world. They were still people with futures. They were still walking. By mile 2, the mylar blanket tore. The wind caught the edge of it, and the material, which is not designed for sustained exposure to 40-mile-per-hour gusts, gave way in a long rip that rendered it useless as insulation within seconds. Wade pulled what remained of it off her shoulders and left it. He moved to her left side, the side the wind was coming from, and positioned himself as a windbreak, his own body absorbing what the mylar had been absorbing. He felt the difference immediately. The wind against his left side was something different from the ambient cold. It was active, investigative, finding every gap in his jacket with professional thoroughness. By mile 3, Carla's gait changed. It became slower, and then shuffled, and then her words began to space themselves out in a way that was not contemplative but effortful. He recognized what was happening the way you recognize something you have read about, intellectually, without having experienced it personally. Her core temperature was dropping. The hypothermia was moving from early to moderate. He did not let his voice change when he recognized it. He started asking her questions. Rapid, specific, requiring actual thought to answer. What does your house look like? What color is the front door? What do you cook on Sundays? Who do you cook it for? She said, Boone. She said, he's going to be so angry. He said, good. Angry means scared. Scared means he loves you. Tell me about Boone. Tell me everything about Boone, and keep talking until you can't think of anything else. She talked about Boone. I want you to understand something about what Wade was doing in those miles. He was 20 years old. He weighed maybe 160 pounds, and he was carrying a meaningful portion of a grown woman's weight across his shoulders through snow that was knee-deep in the drifts and shin-deep everywhere else. He was already cold enough that his hands had stopped hurting, which anyone who has spent real time in serious cold will tell you is not a good sign. When the pain goes, it means the nerve endings are shutting down. It means the cold has won that particular battle and moved on to the next territory. And in the middle of all of that, this young man was asking a stranger about her husband's Sunday meals and monitoring her responses for signs of cognitive slowing. That is not training. That is not instinct. That is a choice. Made deliberately. Made over and over. One step at a time. By mile 4, the road had become theoretical. The highway was there beneath the snow somewhere. Wade knew that intellectually, but there was no visual evidence of it. No painted lines. No mile markers visible above the drifts. He navigated by keeping the tree line equidistant on both sides, maintaining a corridor between the pines on the north shoulder and the pines on the south shoulder, trusting that the road ran between them even when he could not see it. It was the same technique that any survival instructor would have taught him, arrived at independently, through nothing but geometry and a refusal to accept disorientation. At mile 5, Carla lost consciousness. It was not dramatic. There was no collapse, no sudden falling. She simply went quiet mid-sentence and her weight shifted, all of it, and Wade had about 2 seconds to recognize what was happening before her legs stopped working. He went down with her, controlled, lowering them both to the snow so that she was propped against his bent knee rather than face down in the drift. 90 seconds. He counted them. He slapped her cheeks with his open palm, not hard but firmly, repeatedly. He said her name loud enough to be heard over the wind, which meant he was almost shouting. He said it again and again with the flat insistence of someone who is not asking a question but issuing a direction. She came back. Her eyes opened, and they were confused for a moment, and then they found him, and the confusion cleared. He had one granola bar. He had been saving it since yesterday afternoon. He broke it in half and gave her both halves. She said, "What about you?" He said, "I had a big lunch." He had not had a big lunch. He had not eaten since the gas station at 6 in the morning. By mile 6 his hands were no longer reliably his. He could feel pressure. He could feel the general fact of contact when he grabbed something, but the fine motor information had stopped arriving. He adjusted without deciding to adjust, switching from gripping Carla's arm and side with his hands to bracing her with his forearms, wrapping them around her, and using his whole arm as a structural element rather than his fingers. The final 3 miles were narrated differently inside his head than the earlier miles had been. In the first miles there had been something that functioned like internal narration, plans and assessments, and small adjustments. By mile 7 that voice had quieted down to something much more basic. Just the next 10 feet. Just this snowbank. Just to that dark shape that might be a mile marker ahead. The world had shrunk to the space immediately in front of his next step and the weight of the woman against his side and the need to keep those two things in motion. He talked to Carla constantly in these miles. Not asking questions anymore. Just talking. About the warehouse that wasn't there anymore. About what Montana looked like in July when the Bitterroot Valley turned green and the sky was the kind of blue that seemed almost aggressive. About things he would like to see someday. Places he had never been. He talked the way you talk to someone when you are less interested in being heard than in maintaining the sound of a human voice in the dark. Proof that you are still there, still moving, still in this together. At mile 8, his knees buckled. There was no dramatic warning. One step he was upright and the next he was not, his legs simply failing to complete the transaction, and he went down hard into the snow and Carla went with him. They were together in the drift, both of them down, and the wind moved over them with an increased interest, the way it does when obstacles are reduced. He lay there for 10 seconds, maybe 15. He would not have been able to tell you the number, because time had become imprecise. The snow against his face was shockingly cold, and then not cold, and then nothing. His eyes were open and he was looking at the dark sky and the driving snow, and he was aware, with the distant clarity of a man whose body is moving past the point of crisis and into the territory beyond it, that getting up was going to require something that he was not certain he still possessed. Then Carla's hand found his arm. She had to search for it in the snow, and it took her a moment. Her fingers closed around his forearm with a grip that was not strong, but was absolutely deliberate, the grip of someone making a specific and intentional choice. She said his name, barely audible under the wind. Just wait. Nothing else. He got up. He got up because she said his name, and because she was still there, and because he had made a decision at the top of an embankment 60 minutes and 9 miles ago that he was not capable of reversing. He got up the way you do when everything that was going to hurt already hurts, and the only remaining variable is whether you stop. He gathered her back against him. He straightened up. He pointed himself east. And then the worst moment of the entire 9 miles arrived, quietly, without drama, the way the worst moments often do. The town lights were supposed to be visible from the summit of the final grade. The roadside marker at mile 7 had said as much, in the standard highway signage way, indicating the town below. Wade had been holding that promise in front of him like a lamp through the last 2 miles, the idea of lights, the idea of something warm and lit and full of people ahead of him. He reached the top of the final grade, and there was nothing ahead of him. Just darkness and driving snow and the wind and the absolute, featureless absence of anything that looked like human habitation or hope. Either the town's power was out, knocked down by the same storm that had been battering the pass all afternoon, or he had been walking the wrong direction for 9 miles. He looked down at Carla. She was not responding to her name anymore. Boone had called Carla's cell phone at the 2-hour mark. No answer. He had put the phone down and picked it up and called again. No answer. He had done this 7 more times over the next 40 minutes, each time with the interval between attempts growing slightly shorter, the way the intervals do when the thing you are afraid of starts feeling more real. At the 3-hour mark, he stopped calling and stood up. He walked into the main floor of the warehouse where 31 members of the charter were doing the things men do on a Thursday evening, and he said 5 words. Just 5. He said, "Carla's not home yet." He did not say, "I'm worried." He did not say, "I need help." He did not say, "The pass is closed," and she should have called 2 hours ago, and I cannot reach her, and I have a feeling in my chest that I have not had in 20 years of riding difficult roads, and I don't know what to do with it." He just said those 5 words. That was enough. There was no announcement, no call to order, no formal mobilization. Men simply began moving. Pool cues were set down. Drinks were left on tables. Heavy winter gear came off hooks. Within 8 minutes, every truck in the lot was running. Chains on the tires of the 6 heaviest vehicles, spotlights pulled from storage and bolted to the roll bars of the lead 2 trucks. A member named Russ mentioned that his brother-in-law was a licensed paramedic and had ridden over earlier that evening. The brother-in-law, who went by the name of Doc despite not being a doctor, went to his truck and retrieved a trauma bag he kept there as a professional habit. He put it in the back of the lead vehicle without being asked. The convoy left the warehouse parking lot at a speed that was slightly above responsible given the conditions and significantly below what Boone wanted. 6 heavy trucks in a line, studded tires working hard on the packed snow, headlights cutting into the dark. Boone sat in the passenger seat of the lead truck with the window cracked an inch despite the cold, listening. He did not know what he was listening for. He was just not ready to seal himself inside the cab's warmth and heated air when Carla was somewhere out in what was on the other side of the glass. They found the skid marks on the guardrail at the 20-mile marker. The marks were half buried, but the chrome scrape across the steel face of the guardrail was fresh and distinctive. Boone had the door open before the truck stopped moving. His light found the embankment immediately. The broken branches, the path of disturbed snow, the dark shape of the wagon 60 feet below, resting on its side against the pines. He went down the embankment the way he did everything, directly and without wasted motion. The snow was thigh-deep at the bottom, and he waded through it without slowing. He found the wagon. He found the crumpled passenger side, the dead engine, the darkness inside the cab. He found the broken windshield, knocked outward, the edges rough with the marks of hasty removal. He found the cargo net gone from the rear. He found the interior of the cab empty except for a thin layer of safety glass and the dried blood on the inside of the driver's window. Carla was not there. He stood at the bottom of the embankment in the dark for a moment that was very long internally and probably 2 seconds externally. Then his light found the tracks in the snow, 2 sets of them, climbing back up the embankment toward the highway. 1 set of boot prints. 1 set that was different, lighter, less consistent. The track of someone who was being helped up rather than climbing independently. Boone climbed back up to the highway. He stood on the shoulder, and his light swept east along Route 12. Whoever had pulled her out of that car had gone east. On foot. 2 people, one of them injured, walking 9 miles into a blizzard without a vehicle. He did not allow himself to do the full mathematics of what that meant in terms of time elapsed and temperature and human endurance. He started walking ahead of the trucks instead, his spotlight sweeping left and right, left and right. Remember what I told you at the beginning. 2 lives, colliding on this particular stretch of highway in the space of 3 hours, in a way that neither of them could have survived alone. Here is what that looked like from above, if you could have seen it. A young man on his knees in the snow 9 miles east, everything spent, holding a woman who was no longer conscious and looking at a dark sky where there should have been town lights. And a convoy of trucks moving east through the dark from the west, led by a man walking ahead of his own headlights with a spotlight in his hand, scanning the white emptiness for 2 people in the snow, racing toward each other in the dark, neither of them knowing the other was there. Wade saw the light before he heard the engines. It was diffused through the driving snow, a yellow glow that didn't have the cold quality of the sky or the blue-white quality of the moon. It was warm-spectrum light, artificial, moving. It was coming from the west. He raised his right arm. His voice was gone, eroded by hours of cold air and effort into something that could not carry over the wind. He raised the arm and waved it and dropped it and raised it again, a slow mechanical motion, the best signal he had left. The spotlight from the lead truck swung across him and held. Everything after that happened very quickly, and he was not entirely present for all of it. He was aware of the truck stopping. He was aware of a door opening. He was aware of a very large man moving through the snow toward them with a speed that seemed improbable given the conditions, a man in a heavy leather cut with silver at his throat and ink on his hands. He was aware of this man dropping to his knees in the snow beside Carla and saying her name with a quality in his voice that Wade had never personally heard directed at anyone, but recognized immediately as the sound of a person confronting the specific terror of almost losing the person they love most. He was aware of Carla's eyes opening, of the man's hands on her face, careful and enormous and shaking slightly, of the sound she made. Wade had not known whose wife he had been carrying for 9 miles. He had not known what patch meant what, or what the death's head on the back of the man's cut indicated about the reach and loyalty of the organization this man led. He had not known any of it. He just watched the man gather his wife into his arms in the snow, and he thought, good. She made it. She's going to be okay. And then the cold that he had been outrunning for 9 miles finally caught him, and his vision narrowed from the edges inward, and the last thing he saw before it went fully dark was the convoy headlights behind the man, 6 of them in a row, warm and yellow and present in the dark. Wade was brought into the county medical center critical. His core temperature registered at 80 degrees Fahrenheit on intake, placing him in the severe stage of hypothermic shock. His heart was running an arrhythmia that the attending cardiologist described later as a pattern he associated with patients who did not make it. The frostbite on both hands was grade 3. The frostbite on his right foot was grade 4. The laceration on his forearm was infected, the wound having been open and exposed for hours in conditions that were not conducive to sterility. The trauma team worked on him for 4 hours. Carla was stabilized faster. Her leg was a hairline fracture rather than a full break. The head wound required 8 stitches. Her hypothermia was moderate, not severe. The difference between moderate and severe, the doctor told Boone quietly, was the insulation Wade's body had provided during the walk. Without that, moderate becomes severe. Severe, at her exposure duration, becomes something else. Boone sat in the waiting room for 4 hours. He sat in the way of a large man in a small chair, elbows on his knees, face in his hands. The coffee that a nurse brought him went cold, and he didn't drink it. In the 4th hour, the chapter's paramedic found him and sat down beside him. He told Boone what the ER staff had shared with him about the young man they had brought in. The old scars on his back, the type that accumulate over years. The malnutrition that showed in the blood work. The absence of any emergency contact on any form or in any wallet. The $43 in the front pocket of his jeans, now cut away in the trauma bay. The granola bar wrapper, empty. And a piece of paper with an address on it, a warehouse address, for a logistics company that had relocated its operation to the other side of the valley the previous October. He had been chasing a job that did not exist anymore. Walking 9 miles into a blizzard after a lead that had been cold for 4 months. Boone listened to all of this without moving. When it was done, he sat with it for a long time in the silence of the waiting room. A man named Cole, the chapter's road captain, was sitting 3 seats down. After a while, Cole leaned over and said it quietly, the thing that was sitting in the middle of the room that nobody had quite put into a sentence yet. He said he didn't know who she was. He went down that embankment for a stranger. Boone stood up. He walked to the window. Outside, the storm was finally breaking. The clouds were beginning to separate in the east, and the first gray light of the coming dawn was starting to find the line where the mountains ended and the sky began. He stood there for a moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He did not call the chapter's officers. He did not call the sergeant-at-arms or the treasurer or the national contact. He opened the network, the one that connected every charter from the Idaho state line to the North Dakota border, and he made one call. What he said on that call was simple. He said, "A kid with nothing saved my wife's life tonight. I need my brothers to come say thank you." By 6 in the morning, the first bikes were rolling. Wade woke on the 2nd day in the ICU. The first thing he was aware of was the oxygen, the slight pressure of the cannula under his nose, the smell of the hospital air, clean and sharp and completely unlike anything that had been in his nostrils for the last however many hours. The second thing was the sound of the cardiac monitor, the steady, reassuringly regular sound of a heart doing its job. The third thing was the pain in his hands, both of them, a deep bone-level throbbing that told him something serious had happened to them and was in the process of being addressed. His first word was Carla's name, spoken as a question, directed at the ceiling. A nurse answered him before he had finished forming the sentence. She said, "She's down the hall. She's fine. She's been asking about you since she woke up yesterday." He closed his eyes. He kept them closed for a long moment. Then he opened them. There was a large man sitting in the corner chair. He had been there for some time, judging by the empty coffee cup on the table beside him. He was wearing a heavy leather cut with a death's head patch on the back, and he had his elbows on his knees, and he was watching Wade with dark, quiet eyes. Wade looked at him. The man said, "My name is Boone. You carried my wife 9 miles last night." Wade looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he said, "Is she really okay?" Boone said, "She's going home tomorrow." A nurse came in and opened the blinds to let in the morning light. Wade turned his head toward the window. He expected to see the hospital parking lot. He had a vague sense from previous hospital stays, from the 2 times he had been to emergency rooms in his life, of what hospital parking lots looked like. Largely empty in the early morning. A few staff cars, maybe a security vehicle. What he saw instead stopped his breathing. Motorcycles. Row upon row of them, filling every space in the lot and overflowing into the street and lined up along the sidewalk in both directions. Hundreds of them. All the same, chrome and black leather and the death's head patch visible on the backs of the men who stood beside them. Some were drinking coffee. Some were just standing, hands in pockets. Wade even, facing the building. Facing his window. He said, "Who are all those people?" Boone stood up from the corner chair and walked to the window. He lifted the blinds higher. What happened next was not coordinated. No signal was given. No one in the parking lot below could have seen Boone lift the blinds from where they were standing. It began with one man near the front of the lot, who looked up at the window and raised his right fist. Just raised it, steady and vertical, pointing at the second floor. The man beside him saw it and raised his. And the one beside him. And then the row behind them. And then the next row, and the next, and the next, until it moved through the entire parking lot like a tide coming in, quiet and inevitable, until every man standing beside every bike in that lot had his right fist raised in the freezing morning air, pointed at one window on the second floor of the county medical center. 700 fists. Silent. Unwavering. Wade stared at it. He was not a person who had been shown up for. Not once, in 20 years, in any way that counted. There had been no one at his foster care discharge meeting who was there for him specifically rather than for the paperwork. There had been no one in the bleachers at his high school graduation, which he had attended and then left immediately without speaking to anyone because there was no one to speak to. There had been no birthday parties with anyone who came specifically for him. There had been no one waiting, anywhere, ever. 700 men were waiting for him right now. In the freezing February morning, they had ridden through the tail end of a deadly blizzard to be here. They were standing outside a hospital in the cold without being asked to be, without being required to be, without any reason other than the one Boone had given them on a phone call in the middle of the night. "A kid with nothing saved my wife. Come say thank you." And they had come. Boone walked back to the bedside. He reached into the chest pocket of his cut and removed something and placed it on the bedside table next to the water cup and the television remote. It was a business card, the kind printed at an office supply store for an auto salvage business on the south side of town. On the back, in handwriting that was large and deliberate and took up the entire white space, were 2 lines. "Job's yours. Place to stay above the office. As long as you want it." Wade picked it up with bandaged hands. He had to use his palms rather than his fingers, holding it between both hands like something fragile. He read it once. He read it again. He did not cry. He was not a person who cried easily, and 20 years of practice at not crying in front of people did not simply dissolve overnight, even in a hospital bed with frostbitten hands and 700 men raising their fists outside the window. He just held the card. The way you hold something that you were not entirely sure you were ever going to get. The way you hold it when it finally arrives, and the weight of it is so specific and so right that you need a moment just to feel the fact of it in your hands before you do anything else with it. Outside, in the freezing morning air, 700 men held their fists up and waited. Wade had nowhere to go. He had had nowhere to go for 20 years. That was over now.